色不能直接拿来用红的。
说咱们那个题目还行。
啊，对，我看群里都说了嘛，咱们就上那个色。跟咱们那个基础都能实现了，我觉得是可以的。咱们是那意思。
对，哎，咱们什么时候再碰一下啊？行。
还有一哥们儿到现在没出现呢。
就那个外国那个。
对，他跟我说这礼拜 OK。
我记有人。
啊。要不礼拜3也行，礼拜3没事嘛，下午。
或者那什么呢？就是礼拜2上那节课呢。
那也行，
是吧？反正都上课。
行，那就那课结束就行。礼拜2正好开，可以。
他不是讲那个Google是吧？Google Engine吗？
哎哥，那是云应用好吗？哎，这 architecture 好吗？
上面怎么这么多图标？知道哪个是哪个吗？
知道，前一阵用不愿意修。
这个上午的影响，对，我们把那节课安排到晚上，中午最后一节课就好了。干嘛是吧？我这看着是装的。把我这个摄像头挡着。
要不放这儿，大哥？
没事。
哎，我的妈呀！
没事。
你就这样。
没事，没说你挡着，我说我。
我给你让什么位置啊？
注意啊，那个以后得戴个帽子，把那个本子放帽子上面。这啥玩意？
矿工那个。
对。戴帽子，然后别人以为是你这个信号少了。就在人工就在你对我们这信号。我有一次也是有一个外国人，不是外国人，就挺高的，过我前面，然后我去看他背景，这是哪个队？我还得旁边。我以前出来应该是我初中的时候比较矮嘛，然后都坐前面，然后下来。
First thing I'd like to do is a sort of housekeeping. If you look on the Watchel website, the spec for the first course, well, for my coursework for this module is now available. So this is the individual report. Deadline is 13th December.
没事，没挡着。
大哥，这是个韩国人。
啊，不好意思。大哥也会说韩文的，你们不要小看。
I tend to be pretty amenable if people come to me with ideas for things that on hypertext. So there are effectively 3 here. There's one that's looking at effectively the systems, the hypertext systems that aren't the web, and asking you to do some comparison there. There's one that's looking at literary hypertext, and one that's looking back at the very early pioneers, so people like Bush, Nelson, arguably sort of people I'll be talking about in this lecture, and trying to compare what they've done to what the web has turned out to be. In terms of how big it's supposed to be, 1,500 words not including references. I'm asking for it in a particular style, ATM proceeding style. So this is a fairly tight 2-column style that's used for conference proceedings from the Association for Computing Machinery. It's a good habit for them to get into, to write to somebody's specific style. On their web page at this link here, they've got Word templates and LaTeX templates which should hopefully suit you all. I'm asking for a strict page limit of 3 pages. Now that should be more than enough for 1,500 words, but the reason I'm saying 3 pages is because I would prefer to have you write things than to have you cut and you are at Control X, Control V. Okay, on to the lecture. Now, if you look at the schedule for this week and next week, I've actually got 2 lectures in the same thread in adjacent weeks. In previous years, these were actually 2 lectures in the same week, so I apologise for this. I'll break this partway through and then we'll pick up again at this time next week. What I want to look at today is where this thing hypertext came from. Now, most of you, not all of you, but most of you have grown up with the web. Most of you probably don't remember the internet before the web. So for most of you, the web was your first introduction to a hypertext system. And it's very easy to fall into the habit of thinking that the web is hypertext, hypertext is the web. The point of this lecture and next week's lecture will be to look at where hypertext came from. So I talked about the terminology we used for it last week, but actually hypertext, depending on when you measure it from, goes back an awfully long way. So the purpose of these lectures is to try and show you where it came from and show you how the ideas develop and form over time, so you can see where the web came from. Now, I used this definition last week. So this is Ted Nelson's definition of hypertext, the original definition of the word. And I talked through this last week and the sorts of things. So the sorts of things I highlighted were that he had this view that it was, hypertext was written stuff that you couldn't easily present on paper. And he talks a little about sort of non-linearity in area. He talks about choices. But within this, there is this big chunk here. It contains summaries, maps of content, annotations, additions, footnotes. That is not an idea that was new to hypertext. We have this general term that we use for talking about these things, and that's knowledge organisation systems. Now, knowledge organisation systems covers a vast array of different things. It covers everything from library catalogue to things like the Linnaean classification system, ways of organising knowledge, and you can view hypertext as being very much in that tradition, or rather one strand of hypertext. I'll talk about the narrative hypertext strand in a couple of weeks' time. So when we look back at the history of hypertext, actually what we need to do is start a little bit earlier than that. We need to start looking at knowledge organisation, because that way we understand why people like Nelson, why people like Bush came up with this idea of hypertext. And this goes back, it turns out, really quite a long way. Now, some of the histories you'll find of hypertext will pretty much say hypertext started with Vannevar Bush in 1945. I'd like to push that a little bit further back. I'd like to push it about as far back as this. So this is a thing called the Talmud. So it's basically effectively a book of religious law from the Judaism. And the idea here is that this is effectively an encoding of what had previously been an oral tradition. The way it's laid out on the page, in the middle here we have a piece of text which dates back to about second century Common Era, something like that. So this will be a particular law, and under this will be some of the legal analysis of that. So we have the piece at the top called the Mishnah, and underneath this we have the piece called the Gemara, and this sort of comes from about 450 Common Era. Around this are commentaries on this. So this chunk here on the left is a commentary that's from the sort of early medieval period, so it's like the 11th and 12th centuries. On the right we have a commentary on this commentary and also on this text that comes from a little bit later, the 12th or 13th centuries. Around the outside, in the margins, we have all of these marginal annotations that basically are modern commentaries on the commentaries on the commentaries on this law and its legal analysis. So these will be things that say things like, well, you know, Rabbi such and such said this at a certain time, which contrasts with what Rabbi such and such else said somewhere else. If you look back at knowledge organisation, or specifically very structured forms of it, this is one of the earliest things you can find, and this is well over, well, getting on for 1,000 years old, give or take. It's actually quite interesting in some ways, because even though you can look at this and say there are no links here, everything we can tell from this comes from the typography of the page, the juxtaposition of the central column containing the law and its analysis, to the commentaries which wrap around it. So, we have one example of something that you could reasonably take to be a knowledge organisation system, a system for organising religious law. Look a little bit later, and we have this chap, a local man, Richard White of Basingstoke, just up the road, who is chiefly interesting because he tried to produce effectively a sort of a composite history book, this thing called the Historiarum Libri Communatis Antiquitatum Britannicarum, which sort of means history books with notes on British antiquity. So this is something that's happening late 16th century, early 17th century, and there's a lovely quote that's attributed to him about the writing of the book. So as bees take honey from different flowers, so we must take materials from all sorts of different authors, and once they've been systematically collected, store them away, as it were, in paper cones. So one of the things that he does in this is not just say, you know, this thing happened in this year, but he records in endnotes who said that, where did he find that piece of information out from. So this isn't just a history book, this is a history book that's got some provenance built into it, so you can actually read through it and sort of audit where the information came from. He's providing a trail of breadcrumbs for future scholars to be able to analyse this. There is actually a slight downside to this, and it turns out that most of his historical facts came from a work from 1498, Annio de Viterbos Antiquitatum Variarum, so various antiquities, which was mostly made up. So he did the right thing in that he said where he got these things from, but he actually cited a poor quality source. And there's a sort of a lesson in there for all of us. So check your sources, lest you be labelled idiots for citing poor things. But here we've got something that's early modern. We jump ahead a little bit further to the sort of Age of Enlightenment. We then start getting the first really properly concerted efforts in Europe to try and organise knowledge. So we have Ephraim Chambers, who in the early 18th century produces the Cyclopedia. So this is an encyclopedia, and Diderot did his equivalent in the mid-18th century in France. These were attempts to write down all of human knowledge in a book, the encyclopedia. What makes these interesting, not only do they have things like cross-references between entries, effectively links between one entry and another entry, but there's also some sort of overall subject-based classification that's being applied to the contents of these things. So rather than just sort of having to look these things up and maybe trying to know a particular word, what you see in these, and the example I'll give here is from Diderot's encyclopedia, you effectively get a map of all of the sorts of knowledge that exists in this book. So this is Diderot's from 1751, and he tries to break down, you know, a systematic figure of human knowledge, which he breaks down into human knowledge that's about memory, human knowledge that's about reason, human knowledge that's about imagination. And if you then break these things down, so imagination he breaks down into sort of narrative things, dramatic things, and parables. The memory stuff, well, there's sort of, you know, ecclesiastic history, civil history, and then a big chunk here that's about natural history. So, you know, natural history of minerals, vegetables, animals, elements. And in the middle, the reason piece, we've got sort of metaphysics, we've got theology, we've got logic, and so on, morals down here. So there's an attempt here to not only write down knowledge, but to organise it in a fashion that people can find things within it more easily, which is sort of one of the goals that Nelson was talking about with hypertext. Jump a little bit further ahead. If we move from the sort of 18th century into the 19th century, what happened there was that you start seeing not just single people trying to build works that organise knowledge, but you see the formation of organisations that exist beyond the lifetime of a person to try and do this. And I'll talk more about this. But how many people here recognise what that is?
It's a bit scary.
It is a bit scary, right? So I've looked around at it. People are roughly my age. Does somebody want to tell me what this is? It's a library index, it's a card index. So back in the days before we had computers to find things in libraries, the library, the university I was at as an undergrad in the early 90s still had a card index, but nobody used it. When I was a child, my local library still had a card index. So you'd have one card here for every book in the library that would tell you where it was. This is not actually a library card index, but I'll get onto exactly what this is in a few slides. And in fact, there's an interesting thing here. Knowledge organisation gets bound up very closely with things like library and information science. There's a strong thread that leads through from that to the work in hypertext. Now, one of the sort of 19th century developments that's actually a very, very interesting and very specific type of knowledge organisation is this thing, what's called Shepherd's annotations or Shepherd's citations. Is anyone here looking at the website of this? Does any of you do law as a first degree? So you know about things like legal citation then? Right, okay. I'll have to be careful what I say. Okay, so this is a type of knowledge organisation for a very specific domain, which is legal precedent. Now the idea here is, so this is something that originally arose in the United States. And the idea here is that if you're a lawyer and you're trying to construct an argument, what you want to know about are things that have happened in the past that might help you make that argument. So you can buy books that give you listings of court judgments when the arguments are presented. And those are great. The problem is that when you buy the book, it's there as sort of set in stone or set in paper at that point. You can't easily change it. So if you want to update that book with new information, you end up having to scribble things in the margin. So this case here is relevant to this other thing over there. Now there's this chap, Shepherd, who came up with this idea, moving away from purely hand annotation, came up with this idea that you could have a business model that was based on selling people annotations that they could stick into their books. So there's this notion of what were originally called Shepherd's adhesive annotations. So this thing here is a page that's got perforated strips in that's gummed on the back. And what you do is every month you get set you tear them out, lift them, and stick them into the right place of your book, which will give you the extra cross-references. So the sorts of things, reasons why you might want this, you want to know, which cases cite this case. The hand annotation thing doesn't scale. The adhesive annotations go a bit further than this. And then, after this becomes unworkable, they then moved on to this notion where you'd actually have a separate book of citations. So you would have your legal books that give you information about court judgments and things like that, and different court cases, and then you would subscribe to a service that would send you a series of books that will basically give you the cross-references across all of your other books. So this thing, Shepherd's Citation, still going strong. First came along in the early 20th century. In fact, it's so popular in the States that they talk about this as a verb. They talk about shepherdizing a case, meaning to look up a particular case in Shepherd's Citations. Do we have anything equivalent to that in this country? Not that you're aware of, right? Okay. Other people around this time. Now, the reason I sort of titled this section, Organising Utopia, is that actually a lot of the knowledge organisation systems from the early 20th century general purpose things, are explicitly utopian in their vision. Among the first of these things that we can identify was designed by this chap, Paul Otley. Now, Paul Otley is a lawyer, was a lawyer. He is known as the father of information science. So again, we get this link back to libraries. And in the library world, he did things like create UDC, the Universal Decimal Classification System for books, which is a little bit like the Dewey Decimal Classification. One of the things that he's known for in the hypertext community is that with his colleague Henri Lafontaine, they built this thing called the Universal Bibliographic Repository, the RBU. It was their francophone. Now, what this thing was a fee-based service. So the RBU basically was a catalogue of books that had been published. And if you wanted an answer to something, you'd write to them, you'd send them a postcard, they would look it up, and they would look it up in that thing, and they'd send you the answer back. So effectively what we had here was knowledge organisation as a service. I've said here that Otley's an internationalist. Lafontaine, his collaborator, got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1913. He was the head of the International Peace Bureau. And Lafontaine was also the Belgian delegate at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. So these people that were coming up with these sorts of ideas at the point where you had a Europe that had been sort of war-torn for some time, and they were very much looking at these as a way of gathering things together. There are some things that Paul Otley is he's not given quite enough credit for them, but it's quite clear that he did create these things. There are two fundamental bits of historical information science that he's known for. Now, the first of these, certain people have already stuck their hands up about card indexes, should hopefully kind of recognise this. That big card index that I showed you would contain cards like this. So this is something that tells you it's about a particular work. So this is Voltaire's Candide. This is information here about Voltaire, so his dates of birthday to death. Here is the information about the work, so Candide or Optimism, where it's published, when it's published, how big it is, how many pages, where in the library it's stored. It's a class mark that tells you the shelf it's on. In fact, that's a class mark. No, that's not UDC, unfortunately. The other thing, so if you go to the Students' Union shop, you can buy index cards, and they come in a standard size that's 3 inches by 5 inches. That size is due to Paul Otley. There are 75mm by 125mm. The other thing that Otley introduced was this. Now, is there anyone here that recognises what this is? Microfiche. Wow. Microfiche, what this is about the same size as an index card. It's a transparent sheet of plastic, and it's got microscopic reproductions of documents on. So rather than having to store an entire paper document, you can store a piece of plastic about this piece, you put it into a special viewer that enlarges each of these little images. I have a feeling this is actually a repair catalogue for a fridge. It's the only photo of a piece of microfiche I could find. You do still find these in places. In the library here, they've got boxes of microfiche for some sources, but gradually you'll find that these things are being digitised. Now, Otley and Lafontaine created this thing, the RBU, which was, as I say, a sort of a centralised library catalogue that you could go to and ask about things that have been published. They then expanded this, and this is where their view became really quite utopian. Rather than just saying this is something that tells you about published books, this is a central repository for the world's knowledge, and this is moving one step beyond an encyclopedia. So the Mundanium was intended to be a building, a service, a community. And this is something that Otlet and Lafontaine thought about in about 1910. It built on the RBU, or rather it subsumed the RBU. They got a chunk of money from the Belgian government to establish this. Originally it was established in Belgium. That's not actually the Belgian premises, that's a later premises in Mons, which is where it sort of now is. And what you'd have in this, here is those drawers that I showed you earlier. You would go to this service, or you would send them a letter or a postcard asking for a particular piece of information. Can you tell me what the rainfall is in the Amazon? And they would look it up in Nice, and they would send you the information back. Effectively, what you're looking at here is Google for the early 20th century, a sort of Google that's driven by people. And I have to say, even though this, by modern standards, now looks hopelessly archaic, these sorts of things were still common post-war. They were still common into the 1950s. As a complete aside, there's a film called Desk Set with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy in, that's actually set in a bureau that runs one of these things. So this sort of service existed for quite some time. Now, the Mundaneum was intended not just to be a service, and this is where we get even more elaborate, but the centrepiece of a new world city. And they had it all planned out. There was going to be a new world city. It was going to be, well, a couple of places. It was originally planned to be in Geneva, alongside the League of Nations. It had a building that was designed by Le Corbusier for it, that was never built, oddly enough. Unfortunately, these grandiose plans became more and more elaborate, and at the same time, the Belgian government started asking questions about quite where the money was being spent. They withdrew the funding in 1934, and the Brussels site got mothballed at that point. Now, to give you an idea of the sort of breadth of Otlet's vision for this, there's a book that he's known for publishing amongst librarians called Traité de Documentation, a treaty on documentation, which presents his view of how knowledge should be organised. And there's this lovely diagram here which tries to explain all of this. So at the top we've got, things, the universe, reality, the cosmos, and then we have people who think about things, so intelligences. Science sort of coordinates the things which are being thought about, and then that organised stuff is then written down in books. Written down and photographed in books. We then have a bibliography that catalogues and inventories the books, and that bibliography forms the core of an encyclopedia that doesn't just contain information about the books, but information about the things that are in the books. So the idea here that it could be many different types of things. You could have atlases, bits of microfilm, and so on. And tying all this together, you have a classification scheme that lets you organise it all. You can't say that Otlet wasn't ambitious in his view. Also at about the same time, very slightly later, we have this chap, Wilhelm Ostwald, who was a German chemist, he got the Nobel Prize back in 1909 for the manufacture of nitric acid, following from the work on the Haber-Bosch process. Arguably, you could say if it hadn't been for Wilhelm Ostwald, the First World War wouldn't have happened because Germany wouldn't have been able to manufacture the amount of explosives as it did. He was very much inspired by what Otlet had done, and by this point, Otlet's star is fading slightly, the Mundaneum has had funding removed. Ostwald came up with his own attempt. So the idea was this organisation, the DRUC, the International Organisation, the International Institute for the Organising of Knowledge Work. So this was intended to be a sort of a global community of scientists and scholars who would work together and who have their knowledge organised. What's interesting is that he wasn't just talking about the way in which people work together, but he was very specifically talking about the way in which things got published. And he had this view that rather than sort of publishing in many different forms, you could publish in a very restricted fashion in a small number of forms, things that he called monos. So the idea of a mono is it's a small unit of information, a small unit of knowledge that you can arrange and link with other things. And these things would have sort of written cross-references to other monos in the series. We do have him to thank for one thing, and that's A4 paper. So these are examples of his monos. He came up with this idea of what was called the Welt format, the world format. And this was basically a system of paper sizes where each size of paper had the same proportions as every other size, but was twice the size of the previous one. So just as with A4 paper, if you double it, you get A3, if you double it again, you get A2. He had a very similar system here that eventually got folded in with the German DIN organisation who came up with the A classification of paper. So we've got him to thank for the size paper that we use in Europe. Now, just to give you an idea of the sorts of things he's talking about with the book, again, very much in the same style as Otley with the Mundaneum, he used the book as a centralised service, so something that you can go to and ask a question about anything you want. So it'll either tell you directly, or it'll be able to tell you where you can find the information that you're looking for. How well did it manage? It went bankrupt in 1913 and it got disbanded in 1914, just for the start of the First World War. Other people that we've got in this same sort of period who are thinking similar things, H.G. Wells, British science fiction writer, published a pamphlet in 1938 called The World Brain, which again went back to these earlier ideas of Ostwald and Otley. As he says here, it's probable that the idea of an encyclopedia may undergo very considerable extension and elaboration in the near future. The core would be a world synthesis of bibliography and documentation with the indexed archives of the world. A great number of workers would be engaged perpetually in perfecting this index of human knowledge and keeping it up to date. Does that remind you of Wikipedia at all? And so slightly. So, from this period, early 20th century up until 1939, there was quite a lot of work that was going on where people were thinking about how to organise knowledge and thinking at a global scale. So in some senses, you can very much look at these things. You can look at Otley's Mundaneum, you can look at what of de Bruyck actually happened, you can look at Wells's ideas for a world brain, and you can see within those things the things that are the forerunners to the World Wide Web. Those descriptions that I've got from Ostwald and from Wells, and the descriptions I've given you of Otley's Mundaneum, how different to you do they sound like a version of the web that doesn't involve computers? A version of the web that's purely manual. Now, a lot of this stuff got interrupted during the Second World War. The Mundaneum was looted when the Germans invaded Brussels. Most of it was lost. There's some of it still left. It was moved to Mons after the war. De Bruyck was long dead by that point. Wells's World Brain was never built. However, the Second World War also had another important effect on how we organise information. The amount of research and development that happened during the Second World War dwarfed that had happened in the decade previous. And so there was very much seen to be this need to try and enable scientists and engineers to work better within this time. One of the people that was sort of central to this was this chap, Vannevar Bush. Now, he's a bit of a polymath. He was vice president of MIT, he founded Raytheon, he was chair of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which is effectively the forerunner to NASA. During World War II, he directed the US Office of Scientific Research and Development. So he was in charge of all US scientific research and development during the Second World War, which effectively meant he was the director of the Manhattan Project up until 1943. So in some senses, you could look at him and say, well, he's perhaps not the father of the bomb, but certainly the sort of uncle of the bomb. One of the observations that he made during this time was that actually there was too much information for people to deal with. Now, the things that he's also known for, worth going on a slight digression for, one of them is this. This, believe it or not, is a computer. It's a thing called the differential analyzer. It's not a digital computer like the ones we have now. This is an analog computer, and it's used purely for calculating solutions to differential equations. So the idea here is each of these rods running through the system, which you can tie together with gears, represents a number. So you crank a handle, it turns some gears somewhere, and you can see what happens when that number gets multiplied, for example. And you'd read the answers off here at the bottom. Off here on one side are things known as integrators. They're basically like sort of record turntables with wheels on top that effectively can allow you to calculate the area under a curve, which you need to do if you're trying to solve a differential equation numerically. Now, this sort of thing, I mean, this was something that he built in 1931. This very much informed a lot of the stuff that happened during the war. So during the war, battleships had things like fire control computers that told you, if you're here and the other ship's there and you're moving in those directions and the wind is like this is where you point the guns. And effectively what those were very specialised versions of this, something to solve a differential equation. Okay. How many of you recognise what this thing is? It's going to be the same hands as the last time probably. It's this stuff at the bottom.
It's like microfiche but on a roll. I can't remember what we call it.
Microfilm.
Thank you.
So this is exactly that. This is like microfiche but on a roll. Microfiche is great. It's flat. You can move to a particular page quite quickly. It's not that compact. Microfilm is effectively a roll of photographic or microscopic reproductions of pages. During this time, he also did some work on a device called the Rapid Selector. Now, there's a problem here. Again, this is where I showed the age of myself and some of the people in the room. How many of you ever used old-fashioned audio tapes? Yeah, okay, that's a good number of you. Right. The worst thing about an audio tape is when you want to get to a particular song, you've got to sit there and fast forward through it until you get to that point. Or you sit there with a pencil or what have you. There's exactly the same problem with microfilm. So you might have a reel of microfilm that contains a couple of thousand pages, but you want to find one particular page in that, and you've got to sit there fast forwarding through it until you get to the one you want. What he came up with was this idea for a thing called the Rapid Selector. So you have your reels of microfilm that you're projecting onto a screen, but alongside each page on this strip of microfilm is a little pattern of dots. And the idea is that you can use that pattern of dots to search at fast speed for a particular page. So effectively, if you wanted to look for a certain page, you would insert a little card with the right pattern of holes in. You'd shine light through that, and when the pattern on the card matched up with the pattern of dots on the film, it would stop the film running through. So this is something that's like an automated fast forward, skip to a particular place in this document. This and the differential analyzer, I should say, are both things that he did pre-war. During the war, a little busy. 1945, he published this paper. In fact, this is just in July 1945, so this is right at the very end of the Second World War. So after VE Day, or VJ Day. An article in the Atlantic Monthly, which he tried to present a vision, it's a thought experiment for how we could better help scientists, engineers and scholars work with the glutted information that they have. And it's got some very good quotes in it. So the difficulty seems to be not so much that we publish unduly in view of the extent and variety of present-day interests, but rather that publication has been extended far beyond our present ability to make real use of the record. Now, all of you are going to be writing an essay for me, and there are far more papers out there that are relevant than you can comfortably read between now and the time that essay is due in. It's hard. As somebody that tries to keep up to date, I know how hard it is for me to keep up to date with the latest developments in my area. So what he was doing at this point was looking forward to this and saying, well, how could we deal with this? I'm going to explain what this thing on this chap's head is in a moment. It's not actually a Cyclops. Other comments he made. Our ineptitude at getting at the record is largely caused by the artificiality of systems of indexing. And in fact, the sorts of things he's complaining about here are the library systems which have been designed based on the principles that people like Otley laid down. Having found one item, moreover, so we've got a particular book, one has to emerge from the system and re-enter on a new path. You're reading a book, and there's a footnote, and it says, see what Smith said in 1973. And so you go, right, okay, I've now got to go back to the library catalogue, look at the book, I've got to go to the library, I've got to pull the book off the shelf. Where was I? The human mind does not work that way. It operates by association. With one item in its grasp, it snaps instantly to the next, suggested by the association of thoughts. And this sentence is one of the things that we can point to and say, this is really where the idea of hypertext as hypertext first appears. The idea here is that it's not just about being able to index books or organise them, but specifically, we want to try and do things in the way that the human mind does. We want to talk about association between objects. And as he says, the speed of action, the intricacy of trails, the detail of mental pictures is awe-inspiring beyond all else in nature. We want to build things like this because the human brain does these things very well, in other words. The centre part of this thought experiment was this device, the Menex. This is a sort of a mechanical, optical computer come information retrieval system. Some things I'll point out in here. There are banks of microfilm in here. These things here are effectively the rapid selectors that we talked about pre-war that enable you to jump to a particular page. There's a piece here where you can place a document on, it will photograph it, it will automatically develop the film and add it to your collection here. So you can add new documents into the system. Here we've got a couple of places where we can look at different documents that have been retrieved from within the system. And on the right we've got the controls which we can use to indicate what we want to look at next. So this is an analogue computer, an analogue device for organising knowledge. What's interesting in the way that he talks about this is the sorts of things that he envisages us doing. So, he talks about what he calls trails. A trail is just a sequence of pages, but it might not necessarily be the sequence of pages as it appears in the book. It could be an associative trail. You know, there's a page from this book, and a couple of pages from that book, and a couple of pages from this book, and then one page from that book. Basically, bringing together disparate pieces of information into a coherent whole. He also talks about what are known as skip trails. So the idea here is you can take a book and you can produce the sort of executive summary of that book. Here are the bits of the book that are really worth you reading. And the idea here is that you as a scholar could work through this and you could create these sorts of trails, and they'd be on pieces of film that you could then take out and send to your collaborators that they could load into their Menexes. You could also do things like add commentary to work. So you've got a paper here that looks interesting, you want to write something about it, you scribble it on a piece of paper, you photograph it, it's added to the record. And it's added to the record with a link to this document. Here is a commentary on that page. A comment that he comes up with, again, it sounds awfully like Wells. Whole new pools of encyclopedias will appear, ready-made with a mesh of associative trails running through them, ready to be dropped into the Menex and their amplifiers. And again, it's starting to sound a little bit like Wikipedia. The thing I point out is, all of these systems are pre-digital computer. And yet, fundamentally, they're trying to do the same sort of thing that the web is trying to do. They're trying to organise knowledge. And if you look at the sorts of things that Nelson talked about at the beginning, if you look at the sorts of things that Tim Berners-Lee talked about in his original proposal for the web, it was all about organising knowledge. Now, the story changes slightly when we add computers to the mix. And this is, I have to say, this photo is one of these pieces of serendipity that is truly wonderful. Two people here. This chap is Gordon Bell, who worked for DEC, the computer company. In fact, designed this computer, the PDP-6. He later on worked for Microsoft Research, and he ended up being the experimental subject for a project called My Life Bits, which was intended to be almost explicitly an implementation of Nemex. The guy on the right is Alan Kotok, who, well, one of the things he's known for doing is inventing the first computer game, a game called Space War. When he worked for Digital, he got into a conversation with this young software engineer who worked for CERN, who'd come up with this idea for this thing he called the World Wide Web. And he said to Tim Berners-Lee, if you want this thing to grow, what you should do is try and build an organisation, a consortium, an industrial consortium that's responsible for the development of the web. So basically, this chap here was responsible for the establishment of the World Wide Web Consortium, which guards the web standards now. It's quite a good piece of linking there. As Ted Nelson would say, everything is deeply intertangled. Okay, last few minutes. Here we're getting a little bit further into the computerized side. So this chap, Doug Engelbart, worked for Stanford Research Institute at a thing called the Augmentation Research Center. The key role in early internet history was that the computer that he ran received the first packet sent on the internet, or sent on the ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. So, in some senses, without Engelbart, we would have no internet. Without an internet, we would have no web. Another thing that he's known for, what's that thing in his hand? It's not a mouse, it's the mouse, the very first one. So back in 1970 or 6970, in fact there had been a system that he'd been developing in the late 60s, and he needed some way to indicate a position on a screen. Up to that point, the way this was typically done was with a light pen. You'd sort of lift up and press on the screen. He came up with this idea of a device with some wheels inside that could track motion across a desktop. I've seen it, and it's made of wood. It's about as unergonomic a mouse as you could possibly expect, because it's effectively a square box with rounded corners and a very awkward button on it. Another interesting thing I've noted here, ARC. When ARC folded, most of the people that had been there ended up going and working for Xerox, who produced photocopiers. But Xerox had also done an awful lot of the early work in hypertext development, so most of the people that did that came from this institution previously. So he talks about this system. He talks about the need to augment human intellect, the idea that we use a computer to do things beyond things that we can think about directly ourselves. We're great, but we need someone to help us. This is in 1968. So he was talking about using a mainframe computer to organise things like, scratchwork planning, meeting notes, things like that, at a time when an organisation might have one computer for the whole organisation. He built this demo, a thing he called NLS, the online system, that introduced a huge number of things that we now take for granted. So things like displays with windows came from there. The mouse came from there. Video conferencing came from there. It was arguably the first place where we actually saw proper hypertextual linking in a system. Some things didn't quite take off. He had this idea for a chorded keyboard, which is effectively, I can show you on the next slide, this thing down here. It's a 5-key keyboard, and rather than pressing one key at a time, you press them in combination to spell out different things. There is a demonstration of him using this. He gave a live demo at the end of 1968. The link at the bottom still works. It's well worth having a look at, just to remind yourself how much stuff this chap did. It is literally astonishing how prescient this system was. It's not a distributed system, it's a single user system, but a lot of the things that we see in there are things that we then saw in other hypertext systems, including the web, sometime later. And the last person I want to touch on in this segment, Ted Nelson. So we're back to where we started this lecture. Ted Nelson, the chap that coined the term hypertext. famously, he doesn't describe himself as a computer scientist. He's not. He's a sociologist, he's a philosopher, he's a filmmaker. Have any of you seen a film? It's from the 40s and it's called High Society.
Yeah.
His mother is the female reporter. So he's the child of Celeste Holm, who died a couple of years ago, and Ralph Nelson. So sort of had filmmaking in his blood, so to speak. He's also very, very famously opinionated, and he's a lovely chap, but very opinionated. So it's something like this: a user interface should be so simple that a beginner in an emergency can understand it within 10 seconds. Can't disagree with that. Most people are fools, most authority is malignant, God does not exist, and everything is wrong. He has expressed sentiments like that to me on a number of occasions. He might well be right. What I want to leave us for in this lecture is where I first came across hypertext, and this is a reasonable place to break the lecture. Back in the early 90s, before the web had been released, before most people had heard of the internet, BBC Two ran a documentary called Hyperland. It had Tom Baker in it, the fourth Doctor Who. It had Douglas Adams in it, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And it was basically an exploration of this thing, hypertext, told in the style of a hypertext. And it's got some very nice talking heads in it, including this one from Ted. And hopefully you can hear this.
I thought of the idea of hypertext in the fall of 1960, but not under that name, and for years I tried to explain the idea to people everywhere, and apparently most people thought I was literally insane, but it seemed so clear to me from the very beginning that writing should not be sequential, because the problems we all have in writing sequential prose derive from the fact that we're trying to make it all lie down in one long string. And if we could only break it up into different chunks that the reader could choose, why then we wouldn't have to decide what goes in and what goes out. We could just...
The reason is the bump at the end is in the documentary they paused Ted Nelson at that point, and he would have gone on for quite some time longer, I suspect. That's all I'm going to cover for today. I'm going to have to try and work out how we split it between now and next week. Any questions on this stuff? I've been trying to talk about the web without mentioning the web, or certainly not mentioning the web at all. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the week, and have a look at the section 4.